Hi there. In this short business topic video, I just want to explain the difference between labour and capital intensity in business. The distinction between labour intensity and capital intensity is really about understanding what's the right balance between the amount of labour and capital needed in order to operate efficiently. And of course, this varies by industry and it varies by business. But there are some choices to be made by businesses as to what the balance is between the two. A labour-intensive business is one where operations or production are to a large extent reliant on the input of labour, the use of labour resources of different sorts. Whereas we say a business is capital intensive if to a large extent the production or operations are reliant on things like systems and fixed assets rather than people. Here are just a few examples of industries where perhaps you might make quite a credible distinction between labour intensive and capital intensive. Fruit farming, hairdressing, coal mining. Well, you might argue about coal mining increasingly automated, but certainly historically was a very labour intensive process. Fruit farming certainly still is, and I've yet to meet a robot who can cut your hair quite nicely. Capital intensive firms or industries tend to have a very large and significant investment in machinery, fixed assets and automation. A great example, of course, being car manufacturing, which is to a large extent swapped from being labour intensive many decades ago to now being a highly capital intensive and highly automated production process. The key thing to remember about the distinction is the link between the intensity of labour or the intensity of capital usage and unit costs. So for a labour intensive business, we tend to find that the labour costs, the wages and salaries, are much higher than the capital costs, which would include things like depreciation. And often in labour intensive businesses, you'll see that the labour costs are variable in nature. Not all of them, but many of those labour costs are variable. Fruit farming perhaps being a great example of that, where you're paying the employees often on a temporary or seasonal basis based around how much they produce and how much they collect. And of course, in labour intensive businesses, it's often the case that firms are looking to acquire or source the lowest cost labour that they can in order to keep unit costs low. By contrast, in capital intensive businesses, it's often the case that many of the operational costs are fixed. If you're investing in a significant new production line, that cost is going to be fixed regardless of how many units get produced by it. So capital intensive businesses often have a higher level of fixed costs and therefore a higher level of break-even output. Now, is it worth being a labour intensive business? Well, of course, in some industries you don't have any choice. However, there are some benefits of relying to a larger extent on labour, one of which being the fact that labour is a very flexible resource. Labour can be trained. Human beings can be taught more than one skill. They can work on different jobs. And of course, by having people at the heart of the production process, you can ensure or encourage your employees to find new ways of doing stuff, to find ways of continuous improvement, which of course can lead to better quality. It's also possible for labour-intensive businesses to find labour that is particularly low rate or low cost. And that's why a lot of manufacturing businesses in recent decades have moved their operations to countries where wages are much lower than in developed economies. The downside of relying on labour, of course, are the risks and the difficulties of managing a workforce, which I'm sure you'll come across when you look at human resource management. Let's pick out one or two examples there. Well, clearly the risk of issues that arise between employer-employees when relationships become soured or difficult. And of course, businesses that are labour intensive, if they have a high level of labour turnover, that adds to the recruitment and training costs as well as disruption to the business. Many businesses, when they're thinking about the balance between labour and capital intensity, concentrate on the benefits of swapping labour for capital, for example, by implementing automation into some or all aspects of an operation. And of course, the big benefit, if this can be done successfully, is potentially significant improvements in productivity. and also potentially, depending on what the operations are, on quality and speed. The downside of capital intensity, of course, is it requires typically a significant investment. And there's always a risk that you invest in the wrong capital, and therefore you're left with obsolete or low return capital for a significant investment. There we go. That's just a brief introduction to the two concepts there, labour and capital intensity.